How does someone go from losing a leg in combat to becoming the most reliable taxi driver in a small American town? How does a Purple Heart recipient find purpose in driving strangers to appointments and errands? The answer involves a roadside bomb, a long recovery, and a man who discovered that service doesn't end when you leave the battlefield. It just takes different forms. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this inspiring story of resilience, adaptation, and finding new ways to serve, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe heroes come in many forms, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Cedar Falls, Montana, population 8,247, was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, except when it came to Bobby Martinez. For 12 years, Bobby had been driving the only taxi service in town, picking up passengers from the tiny regional airport, taking elderly residents to medical appointments, and providing transportation for anyone who needed to get somewhere without their own vehicle. At 41, Bobby was as reliable as sunrise. His taxi, a well-maintained Crown Victoria that he kept spotlessly clean, could be seen around town 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. Bobby never called in sick, never complained about long hours, and never turned down a fare, no matter how short the distance or how difficult the passenger. The residents of Cedar Falls had come to depend on Bobby in ways that went beyond simple transportation. He was the driver who would wait an extra hour if a medical appointment ran late. He was the one who helped elderly passengers carry their groceries to their front doors. He was the taxi driver who remembered everyone's name, asked about their families, and somehow always knew exactly what radio station each passenger preferred. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, 78 years old and Bobby's most frequent customer, had been riding with him twice a week for 10 years, once to her doctor's appointments in the county seat and once to the grocery store for her weekly shopping. In all that time, she'd never seen Bobby display anything but patience, courtesy, and quiet professionalism. "He's just a good man," Mrs. Henderson would tell her friends. "Never complains about anything. Always on time, always willing to help. I don't know what this town would do without Bobby Martinez." What Mrs. Henderson and the rest of Cedar Falls didn't know was that Bobby Martinez carried more than just passengers in his taxi. He carried the weight of memories from Afghanistan, the daily challenge of navigating life with a prosthetic leg, and the Purple Heart he'd earned when an improvised explosive device changed the course of his life forever. Bobby had perfected the art of ordinary invisibility. He dressed in simple clothes, khakis, polo shirts, comfortable shoes that accommodated his prosthetic without drawing attention. He learned to walk with a gait that minimized the appearance of his disability, and he'd modified his taxi with hand controls that allowed him to drive safely and efficiently without using his left leg. Most importantly, Bobby had never told anyone in Cedar Falls about his military service. As far as the town knew, he was just a hard-working taxi driver who had moved to Montana 12 years ago and built a small but successful transportation business. The truth was more complex. Bobby was a medically retired Army sergeant who had found purpose and peace in the simple act of getting people where they needed to go. Mrs. Henderson's routine medical appointment on a Tuesday in October started like any other ride with Bobby. He picked her up at her house at 9:15 a.m., helped her into the back seat of his taxi, and began the 40-minute drive to the regional medical center where she received treatment for her arthritis. During the drive, Mrs. Henderson chatted about her garden, her grandchildren's upcoming visit, and the new pastor at her church. Bobby listened with the same attentive politeness he brought to all his passengers, occasionally asking questions that showed he remembered details from previous conversations. The medical appointment took longer than expected. Dr. Morrison was running behind schedule, and Mrs. Henderson's examination included some additional tests that hadn't been planned. Bobby waited in the parking lot, reading a paperback novel and occasionally walking around the taxi to stretch his legs and check the vehicle. When Mrs. Henderson finally emerged from the medical center, she was carrying several pharmacy bags and looked tired from the extended appointment. Bobby immediately got out of the taxi to help her, opening the back door and taking the bag so she could settle into her seat comfortably. As Bobby was placing Mrs. Henderson's bags in the front seat, she dropped her purse, and its contents scattered across the floor of the taxi. Bobby immediately knelt down to help her gather the scattered items: wallet, keys, tissues, medications, and the dozen small items that elderly people carry for emergencies and comfort. It was while Bobby was kneeling beside the taxi, reaching under the seat to retrieve Mrs. Henderson's reading glasses, that she noticed something that made her pause. Bobby's left pant leg, which had been hidden while he was standing and walking, was clearly empty below the knee. There was no foot, no ankle, no lower leg, just fabric draped over what appeared to be a prosthetic device. Mrs. Henderson had been riding with Bobby for 10 years, and in all that time, she had never noticed that he was missing his left leg. The realization hit her like a physical shock, not because she was disturbed by his disability, but because she was amazed by how completely he had concealed it and how normally he had been functioning. "Bobby," she said quietly, as he finished collecting her belongings and stood up to close the taxi door. I never realized you had a prosthetic leg." Bobby paused, his hand still on the door handle. For 12 years, he had successfully avoided this conversation, maintaining his privacy and anonymity in a small town where secrets were rare. Now, faced with a direct observation from someone who had become more than just a customer, he had to decide how much of his story to share. "Yes, ma'am," Bobby said simply. "Lost it a while back." Mrs. Henderson looked at Bobby with new understanding, perhaps beginning to comprehend the daily challenges he had been navigating without complaint or recognition. "How?" she asked gently. Bobby got into the driver's seat and started the engine, perhaps buying time to decide how to answer a question he'd been avoiding for 12 years. "Afghanistan," he said finally. "IED explosion. 2012. The simple statement carried enormous weight. Mrs. Henderson realized that her reliable, patient taxi driver was a combat veteran who had been wounded in service to his country, and that he had been driving her around for 10 years without ever mentioning his sacrifice or asking for recognition. "Bobby, why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone?" Bobby adjusted his rearview mirror and pulled out of the medical center parking lot, his driving as smooth and professional as always, despite the personal nature of the conversation. "Because I didn't want people to see me as the guy with one leg," he said. "I wanted them to see me as the guy who could get them where they needed to go." The drive back to Cedar Falls gave Mrs. Henderson the opportunity to ask Bobby about his military service, and for the first time in 12 years, Bobby found himself talking about his experiences in Afghanistan. "I was a transportation specialist with the 82nd Airborne," Bobby explained as they drove through the Montana countryside. "My job was to drive supply convoys between forward operating bases, food, water, ammunition, mail, whatever the troops needed." Mrs. Henderson listened without interrupting, understanding that Bobby was sharing something he rarely discussed. "It was dangerous work," Bobby continued. "The roads were full of IEDs, improvised explosive devices that insurgents planted to target military vehicles. We lost a lot of good soldiers to roadside bombs." "Is that what happened to you?" Bobby nodded. March 15th, 2012. I was driving the lead vehicle in a 3-truck convoy heading to a remote outpost near the Pakistani border. The IED was buried under a culvert about 2 miles from our destination. Bobby's voice remained steady, but Mrs. Henderson could hear the weight of the memory. "The explosion flipped our truck and killed my gunner immediately. My passenger, Specialist Rodriguez, was unconscious and bleeding badly. I was trapped in the driver's seat with my left leg crushed and pinned under the dashboard." Mrs. Henderson felt her breath catch as she realized the magnitude of what Bobby was describing. "How did you get out?" "The other trucks in the convoy stopped to help, but they were taking small arms fire from insurgents who had been waiting for the explosion. I had to help Rodriguez get to safety before I could worry about my own injuries." Bobby paused to navigate around a slow-moving farm vehicle, his driving automatic and precise despite the emotional weight of his story. "I used my knife to cut myself free from the wreckage and dragged Rodriguez about 50 yards to a defensive position behind a rock outcropping. Then I went back for our equipment and sensitive materials so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands." With a crushed leg? Adrenaline is a powerful thing, Bobby said with a slight smile. You don't really feel pain when people are shooting at you and your friends need help. Mrs. Henderson was beginning to understand that Bobby's taxi driving skills, his calm under pressure, his reliability, his ability to navigate challenging situations, had been developed under much more extreme circumstances. The medics couldn't save my leg, Bobby continued. Too much damage to the bones and blood vessels. I spent 8 months at Walter Reed Army Medical Center learning to walk again with a prosthetic. And then you came to Cedar Falls. Eventually. I tried a few different places first. But small towns are good for people who need to start over. Less complicated, fewer expectations, more opportunities to be useful without being the center of attention. Mrs. Henderson nodded, understanding that Bobby had chosen Cedar Falls not just as a place to live, but as a place to rebuild his identity around what he could do, rather than what had happened to him. Bobby, why taxi driving? With your military experience, couldn't you have found other kinds of work? Bobby considered the question as they approached the outskirts of Cedar Falls. I like driving, he said. I'm good at it, and it's useful. People need to get places, and I can help them do that safely and reliably. It's not complicated, but it matters. He paused, then added, plus, driving a taxi lets me serve the community without having to explain my background or ask for special treatment. I can just do the work and let the work speak for itself. Mrs. Henderson realized that Bobby had found a way to continue serving others after his military career ended, and that his choice of taxi driving was as much about mission as it was about employment. Do you miss the Army? She asked. I miss the purpose, Bobby replied. I miss being part of something bigger than myself, being useful in ways that mattered. But driving taxi in Cedar Falls lets me be useful too, just in a different way. As they pulled into Mrs. Henderson's driveway, she looked at Bobby with new appreciation for the man who had been part of her routine for 10 years. Bobby, I want you to know that what you do matters to all of us. You've been taking care of this town in ways that people don't even realize. Bobby helped Mrs. Henderson out of the taxi and carried her bags to her front door, his movements as careful and professional as always. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate that. Will you promise me something? She asked as Bobby prepared to leave. What's that? Don't keep hiding who you are. This town should know what kind of person has been taking care of them all these years. Bobby nodded politely, but Mrs. Henderson could see that he wasn't ready to give up the anonymity that had served him well for 12 years. Mrs. Henderson kept Bobby's secret for exactly 1 week, not because she couldn't be trusted with confidential information, but because she realized that Bobby's story wasn't just his own. It belonged to the entire community that had benefited from his service without knowing it. She started small, mentioning to her friend Martha during their weekly coffee that their taxi driver was a veteran who had been wounded in Afghanistan. Martha, whose own son was serving in the Navy, was immediately interested and asked for more details. He lost his leg to a roadside bomb while saving another soldier, Mrs. Henderson explained. Been driving taxi here for 12 years and never once mentioned his military service or asked for recognition. Word spread through Cedar Falls the way news always spread in small towns, slowly, respectfully, but inevitably. People began looking at Bobby differently, not with pity or excessive gratitude, but with a new understanding of the character and experience that lay behind his quiet professionalism. Tom Patterson, who owned the hardware store, had ridden with Bobby dozens of times over the years and had always been impressed by his reliability and courtesy. When he learned about Bobby's military background, Tom's respect deepened into something approaching reverence. I always wondered why he was so calm, Tom told his wife. Nothing ever seems to rattle him, no matter how difficult the passenger or how bad the weather. Now I understand. He's dealt with situations that make taxi driving look easy. The change in how people interacted with Bobby was subtle but noticeable. Passengers still treated him with the same courtesy they always had, but there was a new dimension to their conversations. Veterans in the community began mentioning their own service during rides with Bobby. Family members of deployed soldiers asked his opinion about military life and deployment challenges. Bobby handled the increased attention with the same quiet grace he brought to everything else, neither seeking recognition nor deflecting it completely. He answered questions when asked, shared insights when appropriate, and continued to provide the same reliable transportation service that had defined his work for 12 years. But perhaps the most significant change came from an unexpected source. The Cedar Falls High School social studies teacher, Linda Morrison, who had heard about Bobby's story through the community network and saw an opportunity to connect her students with living history. "Mr. Martinez," Linda said during a taxi ride to the school district office, "I teach a unit on the Afghanistan war every spring. Would you consider speaking to my students about your experience? Not to glorify war, but to help them understand the reality of military service and the challenges veterans face when they come home." Bobby was initially reluctant. Speaking to teenagers about combat and injury wasn't something he'd ever considered, and his preference for privacy made him hesitant about public presentations. "I'm not much of a speaker," Bobby said, "and I'm not sure what I'd tell them that would be helpful." "You'd tell them the truth," Linda replied, "about service, about sacrifice, about finding ways to keep contributing even after your military career ends. These kids need to hear from someone who's actually lived these experiences." Bobby agreed to think about it, and a week later, he found himself standing in front of 35 high school juniors, talking about his military service for the first time in 12 years. Bobby's presentation to Linda Morrison's social studies class wasn't polished or rehearsed. He stood at the front of the classroom in his usual khakis and polo shirt, looking like exactly what he was, a working-class man who had agreed to share his story with young people who needed to hear it. "I'm not sure what Mrs. Morrison told you about me," Bobby began, "but I'm just a taxi driver who used to be a soldier. I'm here because she thought you might be interested in hearing about what military service is really like." The students, initially skeptical about spending class time listening to a local taxi driver, became increasingly attentive as Bobby talked about his military experience. He described the daily routine of convoy operations in Afghanistan, the early morning briefings, the vehicle inspections, the careful route planning designed to avoid known danger areas. He talked about the responsibility of transporting supplies that kept other soldiers alive and operational. "People think military service is all about combat," Bobby told the students, "but most of it is about logistics, making sure people have what they need when they need it: food, water, ammunition, mail from home. My job was to drive those things from one place to another safely." When Bobby described the IED explosion that ended his military career, he was matter-of-fact rather than dramatic, focusing on the decisions he'd made rather than the trauma he'd experienced. "When something like that happens, you don't have time to think about yourself," he explained. "You think about your teammates, your mission, your responsibility to others. The fear and pain come later." One student asked about the transition from military to civilian life, and Bobby's answer surprised them with its honesty. "It was hard," he said simply, "not just because of the physical challenges, but because I had to figure out who I was when I wasn't a soldier anymore. The military gives you a clear mission, clear expectations, clear ways to measure success. Civilian life is more complicated." "How did you figure it out?" another student asked. "I realized that the mission doesn't end when you leave the military," Bobby replied. "It just changes form. Instead of transporting supplies to soldiers, I transport people to appointments and errands. Instead of serving my country, I serve my community. Same values, different context." The presentation lasted 45 minutes and included questions that ranged from technical details about military equipment to personal inquiries about dealing with disability and finding purpose after trauma. When Bobby finished, the classroom was quiet in a way that teenage classrooms rarely are. One student, whose brother was deployed in Iraq, approached Bobby after class to thank him for his service and to ask his opinion about the challenges her family was facing during the deployment. Linda Morrison watched these interactions with professional satisfaction, understanding that Bobby had provided her students with something no textbook could offer: direct, honest insight into military service and veteran experience from someone who had lived it. "That was exactly what they needed to hear," Linda told Bobby as he prepared to leave. "Would you consider doing this regularly? Maybe once a semester?" Bobby, who had been nervous about the presentation, found that he'd enjoyed the opportunity to share his experience in a way that might help young people understand military service and veteran challenges. "I think I'd like that," he said. 2 years after Mrs. Henderson discovered Bobby's military background, Cedar Falls had quietly adopted their taxi driver as an unofficial ambassador for veteran issues and military service. Bobby continued driving his regular routes, maintaining the same reliability and professionalism that had characterized his work for 14 years, but his role in the community had expanded beyond transportation. He spoke to Linda Morrison students twice each semester, sharing insights about military service, deployment challenges, and veteran transition issues. He served as an informal mentor to young people considering military service, offering realistic perspectives on military life and career opportunities. Most importantly, Bobby had become a resource for other veterans in the Cedar Falls area. When former soldiers moved to the community or visited family members, they often ended up riding in Bobby's taxi, and many found in him someone who understood their experiences and challenges in ways that civilian counselors sometimes couldn't. "There's something about talking to another veteran," explained Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, who had moved to Cedar Falls after completing her Army service. "Bobby understands things that you don't have to explain: what deployment feels like, what it's like to come home, how to find purpose when your military career ends." Bobby's taxi had become an informal veteran support network, connecting former service members with each other and with resources they needed to succeed in civilian life. The Purple Heart that Bobby had earned for his wounds in Afghanistan remained private. He had never displayed it publicly or mentioned it during his presentations. But the Purple Heart values, service, sacrifice, and commitment to others, were evident in everything he did. Mrs. Henderson, now 80 years old, and still Bobby's most frequent passenger, often reflected on the day she'd discovered his prosthetic leg and started the conversation that had revealed his military background. "I'm glad I dropped my purse that day," she told Bobby during one of their regular rides to her medical appointments. "Not because I wanted to invade your privacy, but because this community needed to know what kind of person was taking care of them." Bobby smiled, understanding that Mrs. Henderson's curiosity had led to connections and opportunities that had enriched both his life and the community's understanding of veteran contributions. "I'm glad you asked," Bobby replied. "Turns out hiding who you are isn't as useful as letting people see who you really are." As Bobby drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from a convoy route in Afghanistan to a taxi route in Montana. The work was different, the uniform was different, but the mission remained the same: getting people where they needed to go safely and reliably. Some veterans found their post-military purpose in corporate careers, others in education or public service. Bobby had found his purpose in the simple act of driving a taxi, serving his community one passenger at a time, proving every day that service doesn't end when you hang up the uniform. His prosthetic leg was no longer a secret, but it was also no longer the most important thing about him. What mattered was his reliability, his kindness, his willingness to help others, and his understanding that every job worth doing was also worth doing well. The roads Bobby drove in Cedar Falls were safer and smoother than the convoy routes he'd traveled in Afghanistan, but they led to the same destination: home, where people could count on him to get them where they needed to go. This story was brought to you by Daily Soldier Stories. Have you ever discovered that someone's dedication came from experiences you never knew they had? Share their story in the comments. And if this reminded you that heroes often drive taxis, serve coffee, and work jobs that keep communities running, subscribe to support the channel. Sometimes the most important service happens in the most ordinary places.